Rather, there are, in fact, all kinds of mechanisms that make labor markets hugely more efficient, automatic, and almost costless, driving together people and making the virtual companies. Now, the city, it may turn out, for its physicality, is necessary for an entirely different reason. And this is in particularly important to the transition of Guangzhou as it becomes a knowledge city. The history as a manufacturing base required physicality. It required ports, it required factories, it required a manufacturing concept. And in this regard, this city is almost unique in the world. And in this regard, the transition of the city's historic assets into a new knowledge city presents it the opportunity to begin to be a uniquely new city. It comes down to thinking about what we mean by knowledge and how, in fact, we generate knowledge. Now, going forward into the future, universities are helpful, but they are not the sine qua non that we would believe if we invested in the Porter model of the Silicon Valley, where Stanford was all important, or if we invested in the American notion that for a city to grow, it must have a strong university. Think, as we economists like to tease people, about the counter-narrative, the story we don't focus on. Many of you know about Yale University. It's one of America's most prestigious universities. It's in New Haven, Connecticut, which is a horrible, old, rundown city. So with all those great ideas, how come New Haven isn't the Silicon Valley of the East Coast? The university in which I taught as a young man for 15 years, Johns Hopkins, is the university in all the world with more sponsored research than any other university. Must be you have to be smart to be there. But that's a joke on myself. With all that innovation, wouldn't you expect to see Baltimore as a glistening, beautiful city filled with and driven by all kinds of new firms? And Baltimore is anything but. It's a city falling apart that looks like an old East Coast city with a glorious university sitting in the middle and no new firms of any kind around it. The only firm of consequence that's been formed in Baltimore in 20 years that you know about is Under Armour, which the creation of Under Armour had nothing to do with the presence of the Johns Hopkins University. So these counter-narratives are critical as we think of our enthusiasms going forward. Now, what would I say as we think about the new knowledge city and its composition? And the answer, I believe, is threefold. First, formal education is important in terms of the sciences and the supporting sciences that make innovation happen. The sciences where innovation happens in physics, in electrical engineering, in the composition of pharmacokinetics and biopharmacy and biomechanics, are central to new innovation. And those happen most efficiently in our universities. But incidentally, in the United States and around the world, not as efficiently as they did 20 years ago. Our universities need attending to in terms of their own productivity. Now, the good news is, once the ideas are invented and on progress, we have to make the boundary between universities and the site of the innovators vastly more porous. We can't look to the university to be the cradle of all new firms, certainly not at the scale that the new knowledge city anticipates if it will be the world's leading city. We have to have these ideas leap out of the university easily, and they have to find a matrix in which knowledge workers not connected to universities are able to pull them through. So I think one of the most important things is to engender a culture that begins with the declaration, as this city has already committed to, that what's about to be invented here has no parallel in history. That in fact the beginnings of a new culture are always best started by declaring that the culture you will find here is different from all other places. And I would suggest with great respect that cracking the code in China, in Guangzhou, and in the new knowledge city opens the opportunity for this city to teach the rest of China about one single thing, and that is human creativity and its application in commerce. I've been in your wonderful country now for a week, and as I've given speeches and had private meetings and had very informal discussions with students, I've now looked at over 45 brand new businesses this week. One of the wonderful parts of my job is I get to go see students who have great new ideas. And again, in every situation, someone has raised this question in one form or another. Are we innovative enough? Are we creative enough? And some people, at least one person has said directly, we are great at copying, but we're not so good at creating. And the challenge of the structure of a new culture in the new knowledge city is not just finding new knowledge, but the trick, if you'll recall my beginning quotation, there's nothing as practical as a good theory. The practical trick is to figure out how, in fact, to invent knowledge that is actionable, to bring together human capital in the freest of environments where great ideas from the heads of great people can collide in a way that synthesis happens. At the Kauffman Foundation, we speak about this synthesis in terms of collisions, in terms of coincidences, in terms of happy accidents that are in fact structured. The conditions are in place to structure the happy accidents. It will require greatly creative people of all ages. Of all ages. It will require the capital, which is the simple part of the equation. But the great trick of high growth new firms and the creation of many and many of these new firms is the ideas that are the central focus. I close by saying the new knowledge city should be known as the most efficient idea-generating city on earth. Keep your eye on the culture, not the buildings. Keep your eye on the new infrastructures, not the old infrastructures. Keep your eye on the people and the dozens and hundreds and thousands and potentially millions of people who together will have the happy accidents that when commercialized will produce high growth, the expansion of your economy, and the expansion of net welfare for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Bertil, and thank you, Carl, for the wonderful talk. Now it's my task to first bring the two together in a discussion, and then open the floor to questions from any of our alumni and the officials gathered here. I think I have the privilege as moderator to ask the first question, I think. So I'm going to do that. Carl, you talk about the university being a necessary but not necessarily a sufficient condition for a vibrant entrepreneurial ecosystem. You gave the example of Yale and you gave the example of Johns Hopkins. Of course, we have other examples like Stanford. Now, Bertil talked about how NTU has been moving up in the ranks of research universities and working very hard on enhancing the entrepreneurial ecosystem. And you are also very familiar with all the government initiatives in Singapore trying to build the entrepreneurial ecosystem. So I would pose this question to you, Carl. Having heard from Bertil and having known the Singapore system for some time, what are your prognosis for what Singapore is going to develop as a knowledge-based economy, And then extending from that is how can Singapore help Guangzhou and the knowledge city in terms of developing something like that as well. Carl?
Thank you, Guanyin. Professor Su. One can't see what's going on in Singapore in terms of the focus on people without understanding that the human resource dimension or the human capital dimension is obviously the critical dimension. I think in that regard, Singapore has clearly gotten it right. You asked the question of the prognosis, and that actually is a good time to get out of town because that will be Bertel's job. That is to say, many years of accumulating these human capital resources are under NTU's belt. But to use Bertel's slide of his universe, his solar system, the trick will be, because I think he's exactly right, the notion of all the new innovation comes at the collision of the traditional disciplines. And the trick will be how to get all these folks working together such that, if you will, there's a cloud around in which people are contributing and taking out, and innovation is encouraged. Think the things that are unthinkable. So my general prognosis is very good. I'm a labor economist by training, so it's my religion to believe in human capital. And I'm sufficient to understand that the data doesn't always say that the human capital is working, because a lot of universities, and again, Bertel has pointed out to some universities that one would think some years ago were impregnable. They'd always be number one or number two, or number one or number two. But there are lots of universities that have basically said that's a paradigm we're not even going to quarrel with. In the United States, one of my favorite models is Arizona State, which basically says, well, Harvard was Harvard then. The world doesn't require that kind of Harvard, and if they want to keep being the old kind of Harvard, the world will walk right by them. And I think, in a sense, that's what NTU is betting on, that it will emerge as one of the world's great universities. But one of the great prognosis points is, even as you do it, you see yourself seated in the large societal question of how do we grow the nation's economy. And I can assure you, at Harvard, that question never occurs to anyone. That's not their job. They could care less. And this is a very, very important part of the prognosis.
Thank you very much, Carl. The Arizona State had this slogan called the New American University, and they wanted to create their own new model. And I think this is probably an appropriate time for me to ask Bertil to talk about the model for NTU, because I think one of the things that we are clear about in NTU is that we want to create our own model and not follow anybody else. Bertil?
I think there are two aspects of a model. First, you have to open up the university lateral. As academic, we are actually grown up in an interdisciplinary context. A chemist is a chemist, a physicist is a physicist, and so on. And I think this is very strong. We have schools of this and schools of that, which tend also to preserve this. So I think it's very important now that the board at NTU is taking this decision of concentrate on certain thematic or interdisciplinary areas, because that gives the opportunity to actually open up the university. Interdisciplinary is easy to say, it's hard to do, and you have to introduce new incentive system. It has to be rewarded to work on interdisciplinarity system in environment, a chemist helping an engineer in art and media. I mentioned that. But then you have the next, and that is to work entrepreneurial. Having nature papers and science papers is absolutely necessary, but it's also not sufficient. You have to take it away. And here I liked Carl's analogy. So why